What if one of the most isolated regions on Earth was never truly isolated at all? What if thousands of kilometers of frozen forests and empty land did not stop an empire that built its identity on reaching the impossible? Picture Siberia, endless taiga, permafrost, vast distances where history seems thin, almost absent. A place we are taught to associate with nomads, hunters, and cultures far removed from the ancient civilizations of the West. Now picture something else. A Roman coin, found not near the Mediterranean, but deep inside Siberia. Metal artifacts whose composition does not match local traditions. Objects that follow technological rules unfamiliar to the cultures that supposedly made them. This is not a legend, not fringe history, and not an archaeological mistake. It is a question that has quietly unsettled historians for decades. How far did Rome really reach? For a long time, the answer felt simple. Western Europe, North Africa, the Near East. Clearly defined borders, legions, roads, walls. Beyond them lay the barbarian world, unmapped, decentralized, and above all non-Roman. But archaeology is an inconvenient science. It does not respect borders drawn centuries later, and it has a habit of finding things where they should not exist. In Siberia, a region that barely appears in discussions of antiquity, archaeologists began uncovering objects that raised uncomfortable questions. Items whose form, metallurgy, and craftsmanship closely resemble Roman examples. Not crude imitations, not generic Eurasian trade goods, but objects that carry a very specific technological fingerprint. And that leads to the first serious problem. How did they get there? The standard explanation is trade. Rome traded widely. Its goods reached India, East Africa, even China. But Siberia is not on the way to anywhere. It is not a natural stop on known Roman trade routes. Reaching it would require deliberate movement into territory that lay far beyond Rome's economic centers and political interests. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because if these objects arrived only through indirect exchange, why do they appear in clusters rather than isolated finds? Why do they span different time periods? And why do some show signs of prolonged local use instead of being treated as rare, exotic objects? These are not the traces of a single accidental transaction. They suggest presence, repeated contact, possibly even sustained interaction. At this point, the protagonists of our story enter, not individuals, but methods. Archaeologists, metallurgists, and historians working like forensic investigators. They examine soil layers, chemical signatures, and manufacturing techniques, not legends or assumptions. To them, each artifact is a witness, and some of these witnesses are disturbingly precise. Certain metal objects found in Siberia were produced using techniques characteristic of the Roman world, not broadly Mediterranean, not universally ancient, but methods that point back to Roman workshops and Roman technological traditions. This challenges another deeply held assumption, that Rome was an empire of cities and armies, but not of exploration beyond its borders. In reality, Rome constantly pushed outward, not always with legions, sometimes through merchants, sometimes through envoys, sometimes through people history never bothered to name. Empires rarely end where their maps say they do. And here lies the central conflict of this investigation. Traditional history insists Rome never reached Siberia. Archaeology quietly replies, then explain what was left behind. This does not mean Roman legions marched through frozen forests. It does not mean Siberia was a Roman province. But it does suggest something far more subtle and more disruptive. Rome may not have ruled Siberia, but the evidence suggests it reached it. And if that is true, then we are not dealing with a simple anomaly. We are uncovering a forgotten network of contact, one that expands the ancient world far beyond the limits we were taught to accept. In the next block, we will begin tracing how these Roman traces could have arrived, and what the archaeological record, without speculation, without myth, actually tells us. Once the question is no longer whether Roman traces exist in Siberia, but how they arrived there, the story shifts from shock to reconstruction. This is where archaeology stops provoking and starts explaining. The first mistake is imagining Rome as a static empire, locked behind walls and borders. In reality, Rome functioned more like a moving organism. Its influence traveled far beyond the reach of its legions, along rivers, through intermediaries, across generations of trade and migration. To understand how Roman material culture could reach Siberia, we need to abandon modern maps and think in ancient corridors. One of the most important of these corridors was not a road, but a system of rivers. The Volga, the Don, the Ural. These waterways connected the Roman world to the Eurasian interior long before Siberia had a name. For ancient traders, rivers were highways. Frozen part of the year, dangerous all year, but vastly more efficient than crossing forests on foot. Roman goods moved north through a chain of exchanges. Not Roman merchants traveling end to end, but layered trade. One group trades with the next. Objects move faster than people, and prestige items move fastest of all. This is how Roman silver, bronze vessels, glassware, and coins began appearing far beyond the empire's political control. But Siberia still seems extreme. So archaeologists look closer, not just at what was found, but where it was found. Many Roman-linked artifacts in Siberia are discovered near known migration routes of ancient nomadic groups. The Sarmatians, later the Huns, earlier steppe cultures whose seasonal movements connected Eastern Europe to Central Asia and beyond. These groups were not isolated tribes. They were mobile societies that interacted with Rome as allies, enemies, mercenaries, and trading partners. Some served in Roman armies. Others fought them. Many moved back and forth between worlds. And when people move, they carry objects, but also knowledge. This is where metallurgy becomes critical. Chemical analysis of metal artifacts found in Siberia reveals something unexpected. Some alloys match compositions typical of Roman production, not local Eurasian traditions. The ratios of copper, tin, and trace elements point to Mediterranean ore sources or Roman refining methods. This is not proof of a Roman workshop in Siberia, but it is proof that Roman-made objects traveled far deeper into Eurasia than classical texts ever admit. Coins tell a similar story. Roman coins found in Siberia are often heavily worn, not hoarded as valuables, but circulated, reused, sometimes even pierced or reshaped. This suggests they were not symbolic curiosities. They functioned within local economies as metal, status markers, or ritual objects. In other words, they mattered. And coins do not travel randomly. They follow people, networks, and repeated contact. Another overlooked factor is diplomacy. Rome maintained relationships with distant peoples it never conquered. Envoys, gift exchanges, and political marriages created chains of influence far beyond imperial borders. Luxury goods, metalware, weapons, ornaments were tools of diplomacy. A Roman object found thousands of kilometers away does not mean a Roman stood there, but it does mean Rome was part of that world system. Then there is the military angle. Rome regularly recruited auxiliaries from non-Roman populations. Some of these soldiers came from regions close to the Eurasian steppe. After service, veterans often returned home with Roman equipment, pay, and status. Over time, that equipment moved again, passed down, traded, buried. The farther from Rome, the quieter the evidence becomes. No inscriptions, no Roman buildings, just objects. And that is exactly what archaeologists expect when influence spreads without occupation. What makes Siberia different is not the presence of Roman artifacts, but their persistence. They appear across multiple sites, across centuries, and in contexts that suggest integration, not accident. This forces historians to confront a deeper issue. Our idea of the ancient world is built on texts, and Roman texts rarely cared about lands that did not fight, tax, or glorify Rome. Silence in sources does not mean absence in reality. Archaeology fills those silences. It shows a world where information, materials, and people moved constantly, where center and periphery are modern illusions, where Siberia was not a blank space, but a participant, indirect, distant, but connected. At this stage of the investigation, one thing becomes clear. There is no single path from Rome to Siberia. There are many. Trade chains, nomadic migration, military service, diplomacy, prestige exchange. Layered over centuries, these paths overlap, and that overlap leaves traces. Rome did not need to conquer Siberia to reach it. It only needed to exist as part of a vast Eurasian network. In the next block, we will narrow the focus. We will examine specific archaeological cases, patterns in the finds themselves, and the moments where coincidence becomes statistically impossible. This is where the evidence stops being suggestive and starts becoming uncomfortable. By the time archaeologists began comparing Siberian finds side by side, the problem was no longer distance. It was repetition. A single Roman object found far from the empire can always be explained away. Trade, loot, chance. But patterns are harder to dismiss. Across multiple regions of Siberia, archaeologists documented Roman-linked artifacts appearing in similar contexts, not clustered around a single event, not limited to one century, but recurring, layered, and geographically consistent. This is where coincidence breaks down. The objects themselves tell the story first. Metal vessels, weapon fragments, ornaments, and coins share proportions and production methods typical of the Roman world. Their edges, joins, and where marks follow standards seen in Roman workshops thousands of kilometers away. More importantly, these items are not found in elite tombs alone. They appear in settlements, in mixed assemblages with local tools, used, repaired, and sometimes modified. This suggests integration, not display. One revealing detail is repair. Several metal objects show evidence of local repair techniques applied to Roman-made items. This means the objects remained in use long enough to break, be fixed, and reused. They were not ceremonial trophies. They were part of daily life. Chronology deepens the problem. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy place different Roman-linked objects across several centuries. Some date to the early Roman Empire, others to the late imperial period. This matters because it rules out a single transmission event. Whatever connected Rome to Siberia did not happen once. It happened repeatedly. Geography adds another layer. Finds tend to align with known steppe corridors, routes later used by large-scale migrations. These corridors connect Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Southern Siberia. They were not random paths. They were arteries. And arteries carry more than people. They carry ideas, techniques, and expectations. This is where the idea of Roman presence becomes misleading. What the evidence shows is not colonization, but continuity. Rome did not arrive as a state. It arrived as a system that produced objects valued far beyond its borders. A system whose materials circulated long after the people who made them were gone. One of the most controversial aspects of the Siberian finds is metallurgy. Trace element analysis reveals that some copper alloys match Roman-era Mediterranean production profiles. Not perfectly. Objects were recycled, but closely enough to exclude local origins. This means Roman metal entered a recycling economy, thousands of kilometers from Rome, and recycling leaves fingerprints. When Roman bronze is melted and reused, it does not become anonymous. Its chemical signature survives, diluted but detectable. This is how archaeologists know these objects are not simply Roman style. They are Roman in material history. Another unsettling detail is standardization. Some items conform to Roman dimensional norms, weights, ratios, design logic. These standards were not universally shared across Eurasia. Standards require teaching, or at least prolonged exposure. This raises an uncomfortable possibility that Roman techniques were not just imported, but learned, not by Romans, but by others. Which brings us to people history rarely tracks, intermediaries. Merchants who never reached Rome, but dealt with those who had. Craftsmen who copied techniques without copying identity. Veterans who carried skills home, not banners. In this world, Roman influence spread sideways, not outward, and Siberia becomes a downstream effect of that process. Critics often ask a reasonable question. If Romans reached Siberia, where are the forts, the inscriptions, the roads? The answer is simple. Those are signs of control. What we are seeing is contact. Contact leaves different traces. Portable ones. Subtle ones. The absence of Roman architecture is not a weakness of the argument. It is its strongest support. It means no one is forcing Roman history into a place it does not belong. Instead, the objects speak on their own terms. And they speak consistently. By this point, the investigation reaches a turning point. not because of a single spectacular discovery, but because of accumulation. Too many artifacts, too many matches, too many independent confirmations. At some point, skepticism must change form. From "this cannot be true" to "how could this have happened without leaving more evidence?" And the answer may be uncomfortable, because it suggests that the ancient world was far more interconnected than our categories allow. That Rome was not a point on a map, but a node in a vast system. A system whose edges we are only beginning to see. In the final block, we will step back from artifacts and ask the bigger question. What does this change about how we understand empires, borders, and the limits of ancient history? At some point, the question stops being about Rome. It becomes about history itself, because the evidence uncovered in Siberia does not simply extend the reach of a single empire. It exposes a flaw in how we imagine the ancient world. We're used to thinking in borders, civilization on one side, the unknown on the other, empires as islands of order surrounded by emptiness. But archaeology tells a different story. It shows a world without sharp edges, a world where influence fades gradually, not suddenly, where ideas and materials travel farther than armies ever could. Rome did not need to know Siberia to affect it. It only needed to be connected to people who were connected to people who were connected to Siberia. This is the part modern history struggles with. We like clean narratives, clear beginnings and ends. But ancient reality was messier. The Roman world was not confined to provinces and legions. It existed in trade habits, metal compositions, object preferences, and learned techniques. Those things do not stop at borders. They diffuse. And diffusion leaves traces that look strange only if we expect history to behave neatly. This is why Siberia feels shocking. Not because Roman objects are there, but because we were taught they should not be. For centuries, historians relied primarily on texts. Roman texts, written by Roman elites for Roman audiences. They documented what mattered to Rome: wars, politics, power. They had no reason to describe distant trade chains or indirect contacts. Those details were invisible to imperial storytelling. Archaeology, however, does not tell stories. It records outcomes. A Roman alloy in a Siberian object is not an opinion. It is a fact. And facts like this force a shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "Did Romans reach Siberia?" the more accurate question becomes, "How far did Roman influence propagate through Eurasia?" Once framed that way, Siberia stops being exceptional. It becomes one end of a spectrum, from Britain to India, from North Africa to Central Asia. Rome sat at the center of an enormous web of exchange, conflict, and adaptation. And every web has strands that extend beyond visibility. This also changes how we think about so-called peripheral societies. The peoples of Siberia were not passive recipients of foreign objects. They selected, they adapted, they repurposed. Roman goods survived there not because of Roman power, but because they were useful, durable, or meaningful. They entered local systems on local terms. That matters. It means this is not a story of Roman dominance. It is a story of interaction, and interaction rarely leaves monumental ruins. It leaves subtle continuity. This is why no Roman fort stands in the Siberian forest, and why none is needed. The absence of conquest is precisely what makes the evidence credible. What we are seeing is not empire by force, but empire by circulation. Objects move. People move. Skills move. Political borders do not stop any of these. When viewed this way, Siberia is not outside ancient history. It is simply outside ancient narratives. And those are not the same thing. The real conclusion of this investigation is not that Rome reached Siberia in a dramatic sense. It is that the ancient world was already global enough to make such contact unsurprising, once we stop limiting it with modern assumptions. History did not end at the edge of the map. The map was drawn later. What archaeology reveals is a deeper truth, that long before modern globalization, human networks were already stretching farther than memory, farther than writing, farther than belief. And sometimes, the only way to see those networks is to look where history said nothing ever happened.